Okay, it's 6:30, so I'm not sure whether we should start or wait 5 more minutes.
It's up to you. You can let me know however you prefer.
I don't know, maybe we will wait like 3 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so it's 6:32. I think we should start. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our today's speaker, Medhę Chaturvedi. Medhę is, she conducted her research at the University of Heidelberg at the Institute of South Asia. But she was also a fellow in Berlin and Budapest at the Central European University, a scholarship holder of Volkswagen Foundation. Her research interests are indigenous rights, human rights, corporate government nexus, environmental justice. And she wrote her PhD in Heidelberg, and she's very close to completing it with her viva. So, Medhę, please.
Thank you, Maria, for giving me that warm introduction. Yes, I am quite close to completing the PhD, but not quite done. So what I will be presenting today is all the research I have done towards my PhD. And most of it will concentrate on a little bit of background on the results and discussions that I have found to be very valuable in understanding the issue that I am going to talk about today. So if I can share my screen, here we go. Yes, I suppose you can see this now.
We can.
Okay, all right. So the topic of my research has been for the last 3.5 to 4 years, human and environmental cost of open cast mining. In this context, I have done a comparative analysis of two mountain ranges in eastern India. One is called Baila Dila, which is my primary research study, which is in the eastern state of Chhattisgarh in India, and it is replete with iron ore or banded hematite mines over there, which are mostly used for exports. The second study is that of Niyamgiri Hills in another eastern state, Odisha in India. And this state has a potential bauxite mine, which was given a go ahead in 2003 by the government of Odisha in collaboration with a private mining company called Vedanta. However, the Supreme Court put a stay on this mining, so that has been stopped. So the primary basis for analysis is, or comparative analysis, is to see how modes of resistance in one particular area were different from the other, where in one case the mining took place and the ill effects of mining can be seen quite significantly, while in the other mining was stopped even before it began. As Maria already mentioned, that I am associated with the South Asia Institute at the Heidelberg University. My supervisor is Professor Dr. Marcus Nusser, who's the head of the geography department at the institute. And this research was funded by the Tata Higher Education Trust, who were the scholarship provider for my first 2 years of PhD. So the structure I'll be following today is to give you a brief introduction of what the case studies are all about. Second, after that, we will talk about the methods I used, followed by the results and some discussion on those results. I will try to keep it short so that there is more time for questions. However, I cannot promise that. Let's move forward. Yes. So the primary research question that I have achieved, or I have tried to answer in this dissertation, is what is the impact of protracted exposure to open cast mining on the health of the communities living around the mines, and how is the environment of the area thus affected? Now, what exactly is open cast mining? Let's take a look at that first. Open cast mining is when there is a mining activity for minerals specifically, which is done on a plateau, which is either naturally existent or created through deforestation and flattening out the tops of the mountains. So the open cast mining basically is an ancient, or rather a technologically heavy process, which requires not only extraction but also refining and transportation of the metal, causing a great deal of loss of forest cover, especially in the mountainous ranges. Then the second question I have aimed to answer is, in areas with questionable free and prior informed consent, do mining companies have a responsibility to protect local indigenous communities? And if so, are they fulfilling this responsibility? Now, free and prior informed consent is an internationally accepted framework where indigenous communities are seen as the guardians of the lands on which they reside. These communities informed consent, unless it is taken without any sort of coercion, unless that consent is taken, no amount of technological or corporate activity can take place in these indigenous lands. This applies to indigenous lands in Asia, South America, North America, Africa, and even Europe and Australia. So this is a universally applicable principle. It's not a law, of course, but it's a principle. And in some countries, like in India, it is a part of the constitution to obtain such free and prior informed consent from indigenous communities before conducting any kind of human activity in indigenous lands. And the third and final question is representation and different modes of resistance. How do they impact citizen welfare? What I alluded to earlier, this is a part of that how is it that resistance in one case, which is quite similar in terms of demographics, geography, and environment, and the ecology of the area, how is it that modes of resistance succeeded in one case and not in the other, even though they have been going on in both the cases? The working hypothesis I have, or now the hypothesis, is that the impact of protracted anthropogenic open cast mining on human and environmental health is profound. And this can be verified through a series of verifiable inferences. I have used several methods to test this. Most of them are qualitative, some of them are quantitative, but it is culminated into a set of conclusions that towards the end I will be happy to present and talk about. The two focus states I have taken into consideration, as I mentioned, are in the eastern part of the country. So this is no, the yellow one is Orissa, and within that is the Niyamgiri, the bauxite mine, and the orange one is Chhattisgarh. Within that, it is the Bailadila mines in the district called Dantewada. Both of these states have a very high tribal component in the population. In fact, the highest in the country for both of them. They are the two largest mineral producing states in India, and have a high number of indigenous communities, which are classified by the Indian government as primitive vulnerable tribal groups under the Indian constitution, which means that these are protected tribal groups or protected indigenous groups. And according to the constitutional provisions that they have. So they have those rights. Whether those rights are exercised or not, we will see as we progress. Both of these states have a rather significant history of contestation, with a lot of with a significant role for both of them in India's independence struggle, and also they have a high amount of Naxalite activity. Now, to define the term Naxalite, it is classified as left-wing extremism by the Indian government, and it was a movement by the people which has culminated into a insurgency in in these parts, in the eastern part of the country, which has been going on since the time of India's independence in 1947. So it is considered to be the longest running insurgency in India at the moment. And both of them are in lower mountainous forested terrains, which with heavy to very heavy forest cover. So, for example, to do field work in these areas was quite challenging because there is no access points. One has to either hike through the forest or take a motorcycle to a certain distance, and then from in a forest where there is no road, and then from there continue hiking. As you can see in these satellite images, that they are in fact quite thick in terms of very dense forest cover. The summary of methods that I have approached or I have taken, and these are derived from the theoretical perspectives of Marxist geography, where I have taken a deeper look into David Harvey's work on accumulation by dispossession and political ecology, where I have taken a deeper look into the work by Michael Watts, in the work that he has done with indigenous communities and the Shell case study in the Niger Delta. I have also looked at uneven development by Neil Smith as one of the theoretical perspectives. And based on these frameworks, I have arrived at my methods, which can be qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. Most of the methods I have chosen are in fact either qualitative or mixed, and quantitative is just one or two of them. In the qualitative methods, I have the participant observation, personal interviews, focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and still photography. This is towards visual ethnography. And each of these have been conducted over fieldworks, over 6 fieldwork in a span of between 2016 and 2019. And each of the fieldworks for a minimum of 6 weeks. In the first field work, I only did direct observation, where I didn't raise any kind of research questions. The only thing I did was to talk to the people around and understand what their primary concerns were. And then thereafter, from the second visit onwards, it was participant observation, where they were fully aware of what questions I was raising, and then they were reacting to those. The focus group discussions was an interesting experience because we tried to do mixed group discussions, but it turned out that in mixed groups, gender mixed groups, the females were unable to put their opinions across without the fear of being judged. So it was quite interesting to watch the dynamics change when we did gender specific focus group discussions. Still photography is an important aspect of this research, and you will see why in just a few moments, because the scale of damage and the scale of effect that this open cast mining has caused in the Bailadila ranges is unfathomable. And just to have a look at it would give you an idea about how horrific the impact has been so far. In terms of quantitative method, I did a basic illness recall survey, which I complemented or supplemented with with some of the health data. I will discuss the limitations towards the end of this presentation anyway, but one limitation I can already mention here is that official data has been manipulated quite significantly in in all kinds of rural research in India, but this in particular had a very shocking set of gaps in the official data. For instance, any illness related to the stomach, whether it was a mild stomach ache to stomach cancer, was classified under one bracket, which was called acute stomach disorders. And this is only one example of why the data has been rather unreliable. So we did this illness recall survey, and based on that, we did a chemical water analysis to corroborate what the illnesses coming out of the water contamination were, and were they corresponding to the minerals and metals found in the water. There were mixed methods where I did some sequential methods and some concurrent methods. With sequential methods, as I mentioned, did the illness recall survey with chemical water testing to assess the current and potential health impact of mining, and to see if all of it fits in with the narrative that chemical water testing, if it shows me that I have the water has an intense amount of iron, or the water has an intense amount of nitrites, then does the illness recall survey point to the fact that people have illnesses which are commonly associated with excess of these elements. So this was the sequential method we did. And then in concurrent methods, I did remote sensing and visual ethnography through still photographs to demonstrate the spread of mining area and its impact on environmental commons. So remote sensing was to just look through the Landsat images and see that from, again, here data availability was a problem because Landsat images, which were the earliest ones available, were only from 1988, while this mine had been in operation since 1958. So it was difficult to find images before that, but then there were some old corona images which we were able to isolate and use to see that what was the original forest cover and what was the spread of mine, and then compare it to the current remote sensing images to see how much the mines have spread. And based on this, we also did some photographs in the same areas where you can see the satellite images, just to see how much the mines have in fact spread. And of course, within that, there is also the comparative analysis of the Bailadila and Niyamgiri case studies through fieldwork and media discourse analysis. This is basically what was done, and this is the empirical data collection process where, like, I've written 5, but I had done 6 field visits because I think I didn't count the first one where I didn't really have the research question out, so it was only direct observation. And the secondary health and governance data by the district authorities was also collected in these, including the field interviews, of course, and the focus group discussion and illness recall surveys. And then chemical water testing. This I had to do in collaboration with the local university in the state capital, because being a scheduled and protected area, I was not allowed to take out any kind of resources from this area, especially when they knew what my research was about. It was quite a limiting and challenging factor in that moment. And the secondary satellite data through remote sensing was done in collaboration with my colleagues in the South Asia Institute. Now, coming to the spread of mining area, now we are already at the results part of this. As you can see in this remote sensing image, and as I mentioned, there is one image from 1965, which is only the purple line. And comparing it to the 2018 yellow lines, you can see that the spread has been rather significant. The mines at the moment are only at the south side of the hill, but starting 2021, the government has already given clearances for more mines to be set up in this area. So the spread of mines is quite significantly visible, and the corona images show that where the mines exist now, there were roads even before the mines actually became operational. And also some smaller mines were existing even before the mines officially became operational, which means that mining activity without any licensing and permits had been carried on in this area even prior to the official permissions. One interesting fact to note here is that the primary mining company which is doing mining activity in this of iron ore in this area is called the National Mineral Development Corporation, which is a public sector undertaking, which means it's wholly owned by the government. So the government company is doing the mining, and this had been done even before they had clearances, environmental clearances, and permissions to do mining in this area. There has been a significant loss of forest cover, and while environmental clearances were given contingent to the condition that there has to be reforestation every time there is deforestation in this area. The reforestation has been more or less a joke in this area because they are reforesting forest lands with grass shrubberies, and that too at the foothills of the mining area. So the dense forest cover loss has been intense. And while the Chhattisgarh state government reminds the people, or reminds me as a researcher, that the overall forest cover has increased in the state, the overall dense forest cover in this area has shrunk down to about 50% of what it was in 1965. So this has been quite a significant change, and a shocking one at that too. Because in just a span of a few decades, it has shrunk down by 50% because of the mining activity. And this has led to a great loss of protected flora and fauna as well in this area. The increased number of benches are visible through satellite images also. So first, let's take a look at what benches mean. In any kind of open cast mining, the activity or the mining operations are done by creating these sort of levels within the plateau. And these levels make it easier to extract the ore. These levels are called benches. And so the benches have been used or have increased in numbers, and each of these benches is about 120 meters. So it's quite a large area, but it has only been increasing as the time has passed. Interviews reveal changes in land use patterns and quality of life, also water quality. In personal interviews, it turned out that a lot of the people who were dependent on the forest produce can no longer rely on that anymore. And so, what has happened is that the land on which they were, for example, cultivating paddy, which is the primary crop from this area, they are unable to do so now. And so what they are doing instead are taking up jobs, odd jobs in the mines, which are unskilled jobs, and have become daily wage laborers, being paid quite a low minimum wage. And the water quality has really been altered, because the water running in these areas from the main rivers which originate from this hill is absolutely dense with ferric iron, which is non-soluble, and the only way that it can be expelled is through vomiting and diarrhea. Now the problem here is that even though in small quantities ferric iron is not as dangerous because it doesn't have long-term impact in small quantities, but with the protracted exposure, it has the potential to cause a lot of other changes, which we will discuss further in the discussion part. The livestock has been affected too by the span of their life being reduced to a certain significant amount, because they are also dependent on the water from the river, which is severely contaminated. So drinking that water, it impacts their lifespan as well. Now, in this satellite image, you can see that this is the benches that I was talking about. These are the mining benches, and this is from Google Earth, of course, but yes, and these benches are from where the mineral is extracted. So what you see here, whatever is gray is the most purest form of the ore, and the international standard for purity is judged at 68%. So normally one is supposed to mix it to make it to 68%. In case this is already at a 80%, in certain benches at an 80% purity level, so it has to be mixed with the red ore, which is not yet 100% formed, to make it 68%, which is then internationally tradable. So these mines or these benches look like this in real life. This is what I was talking about, that on the plateau, you have to create benches to be able to easily extract ore. This yellow extractor over here goes around these benches to collect the ore. And every time one bench is done, then you have to keep creating the next one. This particular portion in the yellow box is the river that I was talking about, the Shankini Dankini River, the primary lifeline of this research of this area, on which the indigenous communities depend for not only the fresh water, but also the groundwater. So the groundwater is also fed by this river. And this river originates where the mines are, in this hill, so where the mines exist. And this is what the river looks like. None of these photos are retouched. So this is the actual color of the river now. And post-monsoon it becomes even worse, but this is pre-monsoon and it is already quite horrifyingly bad. What you see in these satellite images in this corner over here, for example, 1, or in this corner over here, number 2, or over here, number 3, these are the check dam, the tailing dams, which are created to store the slurry, which is a result of the refining process of the mine. So this going forward, because the quantity is so high from this mine, that going forward, this only contaminates the soil around it as well, because it tends to leak into the water sources, it tends to leak into the soil, it just tends to leak into every possible area around. The illness recall survey gave us some interesting insights as well. So we had interviewed 447 people, out of which each of them had at least some illness or the other. If you see that none is the maroon color bar, and you can't see it because there was nobody of these 447 people who reported that they had not suffered any kind of illness, either skin or eyes or stomach or some kind of other illness, 2 or more, or all of them. So 402 out of 447 people in a span of the 2 years preceding this illness recall survey had faced each one of these illnesses based on the use of contaminated water. They had skin irritation, eyes, stomach, every kind of illness perceivable. They had suffered it already. From the chemical water testing we did, we used we found or we checked the water for a few parameters. One of them, the primary one, was iron. Then we also checked it for manganese, fluoride, sulfide, and arsenic. And in addition to arsenic, we also checked it for lead. We also checked the pH balance of the water to determine whether the water was acidic or basis. And we also checked for nitrates and nitrites in the water, especially in the groundwater, we checked that. It was an interesting revelation because so we did, since I had since my funding was quite limited in this context, I was limited to only doing sampling from 5 surface water sources and 5 groundwater sources. So in the surface water sources, as you can see, that most of the water samples show a high base content on the pH scale. However, there was one surface water source from near the tailings dam, or the part of the river right next to the tailings dam, where it was just pure acid. There was nothing in that water. The pH was 1, or the pH was between 1 and 2, and it was just pure acid. And when we checked it for iron, it had a pretty high iron concentration, of course. The permissible limit of iron by World Health Organization standards, and this is not meant to be relaxed by any way, is zero point 0.3 milligram per liter. And in most of the water samples from surface water, this was significantly higher. Um, the presence of nitrates also indicates that there had been some sort of contamination with regard to some sort of overlap with with probably a sewage line or something like that, because there was when we checked for the bacteria, I didn't do the complete analysis, but I used a yeast-based bacteria indicator, which indicated the presence, only the presence, not the quantity, of colloidal, salmonella, and parasitical bacteria in the water. There was not even one sample where bacteria was not present. In fact, in most of them, it was present to a point where instead of 48 hours when it was supposed to turn black, it was already gray and black and differently colored within the first day itself. Let's go forward. Okay. Now, the groundwater samples paint not a very different picture. In fact, an even more horrifying picture. These water samples are from either bore wells or hand pumps, and one of them is from a solar water filtration method. So the solar water filtration method was the one with this one, 28 degrees and 0.374. Here the water sample was cleaner than the rest of it. The bacteria was lower than the rest of it. However, the amount of nitrates in this water sample was also quite concerning. With regard to one of the water samples, which was the worst in this situation, was a groundwater sample from a hand pump where, as I mentioned earlier, 0.3 milligram is a permissible limit per liter, and the detectable level in that was 18.9 or almost 19 milligram per liter. It was quite horrific that it was this high, and this was the results that we found from this particular water sample from a hand pump. And in front of us, people were actually drinking water from that hand pump and were offering us water to drink from that one particular hand pump. With regard to the interpretation of these results, the loss of forest cover, as I mentioned, through remote sensing images is quite evident. But through photographs, it becomes even more stark because, as you can see, the plateau was created on top of the hill, and from there they not only created a mine but also a storage unit plus a conveyor belt to take it down to the refinery and a refinery. And the people who were living in these forests had to be relocated. Now they weren't given proper rehabilitation, they were just asked to leave, and that's what they ended up doing. In addition to this, the noise pollution in this area led to the demise of a lot of rare bird species, migratory bird species who were commonly visiting these areas. They no longer visit. In fact, a lot of very valuable flora and fauna was lost in this process. The Shankini Dankini River, which I talked about, which originates from this part of the mountain, these are two perennial rivers which join into the Indiravati river system, which is one of the largest river systems in this part of the country, and that joins into the Godavari river system, which is the third largest river network in India. So the potential impact of this iron overload goes hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. Although the primary impact is in these 155 villages surrounding this mining area. Now, do the mining companies use the same water is the question we raised to them. The answer was quite, as you may be able to guess by now, was quite simple. They don't. They have a separate pipeline which comes hundreds of kilometers from a different state and carries water from a completely different and unconnected river system. And so when asked this question from the head of the mining company in this area, that why is it that you're not using the same water, they said because we know it is not fit for consumption. So that means that they were willfully compliant in this thing, that they know that this water is unsafe, but they don't mind subjecting the local people to that water as long as the mine, as the mining campus in itself has access to clearer and cleaner water. Can this indicate willful complicity? Absolutely. Because the health of these communities is not only endangered, but the lifespan is being cut short by decades and decades of exposure to this absolutely dangerous water. Uh, this is the source of the river, which is within the mine compound, and right where the river originates, right after that is this dam where the contamination begins already at the source. Dumping of slurry, dumping of ore, dumping of fine particulate material. And this is one of the tailings dam, as I was mentioning earlier. It is absolutely, it's almost like that it's an end of the world scenario near these tailings dams. This is the other tailings dam where they do unchecked slurry dumping. I will repeat that these pictures haven't been color corrected. This actually is the color of the slurry which is being dumped. This was around noon that this photo was taken, and this slurry dumping continues from 5 in the morning to around 11:30 at night. So these tailings dam are not sufficient to contain or the slurry. And so it always overflows. And these were prime farmlands which were taken into this. So what has happened as a result is that the paddy which grows around these slurry dumping grounds, tailings dams, is unfit for consumption. It has these black tops on the rice, and the people over there do eat it, but it only adds to the iron overload that they're already suffering from. As I mentioned, that the water samples were all quite horrific, especially from the hand pumps, which was a shock to me that the direct consumption water was quite dirty. And these were the bacterial testing kits that we had. And as you can see in this graph, this is the permissible limit by World Health Organization. And between the ground and surface water samples, only one of them was below the permissible limit. The health impact has been profound. One thing we found out with the government data on this is that sickle cell anemia is quite common in this area. The reason for it is unknown, but the fact that it is common makes it even worse to know iron overload is causing problems within this community. Now, with sickle cell anemia specifically, when there is an iron overload, it causes the cells to absorb even less oxygen than they could, and leading to a significant loss in the lifespan of the communities. Then there are a lot of, it also changes lipid and fat profile when there is a prolonged exposure to ferric iron. As I mentioned, with short-term exposure, it is not so dangerous, but the prolonged exposure can have a lot of cellular level changes as well. A lot of these children whom we encountered and interviewed during this time were suffering from kwashiorkor and marasmus, which were illnesses related to absorption of nutrients from the food that they are eating. Having consulted with the doctor, we realized that when a pregnant woman consumes this water for a prolonged period of time, it affects the developmental growth of the fetus, also leading to the developmental growth deficiencies in children. And these deficiencies can cause a slower absorption of nutrients. So even if they eat the same amount of nutritious food as a child, maybe in a better maybe in better conditions, their body refuses to absorb those nutrients, and they expel it because of the iron overload. And the communicable diseases, of course, were hepatitis A, fatal diarrhea, skin disorders, and even in some cases, skeletal disfiguration. Although I must confess, skeletal disfiguration was rampant in only 2 villages of the villages which were surveyed in this particular research. Now, coming to the Niyamgiri movement, this is a short timeline to show that from 2003, when the government of Orissa gave the other bauxite mine a go ahead to continue mining to this company called Vedanta, which is a UK-based company. The community, the tribal community, and the indigenous people came together and started protesting. The prime difference between their protests and the protests in Bailadila has been that they used existing constitutional provisions to their advantage, and they put emphasis on educating community members as opposed to relying on outside support for this. They did rely on one little tidbit of information for outside support, which was to attack the funding of the project altogether. If you know of the movie Avatar, that film is the Navi people in that film are based on the people in Niyamgiri Hills, and so who are called the Dongria Kond. And so the Dongria Kond community leaders use this information to get all this published in the international media. During a media discourse analysis, we found that this had been mentioned. So this particular case had been mentioned more than 600 times in a span of 2 years, preceding 2013, while the Bailadila had not been mentioned even once. So they use this international connection to get to gain attention to their cause, and as a result, that all the funders of this particular project started withdrawing one by one, starting with Church of England, Norwegian Pension Fund, Deutsche Bank, and many other influential companies worldwide. They started withdrawing because of the embarrassment that this had been causing them. And so, in the end, the Supreme Court also took cognizance of the environmental clearances, which were not adhered to, and put a stay order on the mining project. Even though the refinery had been set up, the project could never take off. And the government of Orissa and this private entity has been making attempts to uh, to um, uh, to
Oh, Medhę, we couldn't hear you for a moment. No, you are mute.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think my internet connection is a bit weak today, but I'm almost towards the end of it, so I'll share my screen again. Okay, here we are. Okay, so the Dongria Kon community only has about 6,800 people, but because they have used the influence that they have in such an effective and productive way, they were able to completely close off the mining activity. The primary reason why they don't want mining is because not only do they consider this mine sacred, but they consider the top of the mountain as the god, as their god. So it is for them a cultural an issue of preserving not only their human rights but also their cultural rights. um, okay, and the resistance which came in this particular case was from the ground level. As I mentioned, it was the community members who were active in resisting the big mining company rather than looking at external support for their cause. This has been instrumental in making sure that they were able to save their mountain. The legal recourse they sought, of course, they needed a lawyer who was from outside, but it was all in line with the constitutional provisions. They didn't demand, not even once, for anything to be changed as it stands in the constitution. They didn't demand anything to be changed in the environmental law in India. They were just demanding what was due to them. And so that helped their cause in a way that the Supreme Court could not deny them this right, because they said, yes, it is did is cut the funding at source for this project altogether. As a result, the project became, it was unable to be as viable as it would have liked to be. Can you still hear me, or is there a problem with the connection?
No, you stopped for just a while and we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Now, this is one of the last parts that I'm going to be comparing the modes of contestation between the two case studies. As I mentioned, Niyamgiri was a ground-based or ground-level movement which was ideologically motivated. It focused more on the common goal of all the people living in all the villages around this mountain rather than individual goals that people had. For the most part. In Bailadila, the protests have remained fragmented and they are based on very little let's say common ground. It is mostly fragmented ideological differences on which they are trying to fight, and they are looking at only local issues. They are not looking at the larger picture. So that has been a downfall of this movement. In Niyamgiri, because it is ideologically motivated and comes from the ground up, the leaders are from within the community rather than external support. And in Bailadila, leaders have remained stricken with intra-tribal factionalism. And that has caused a big problem for them because they haven't been able to come together as a united front. Then the Niyamgiri, with engagement with pressure groups like international media, civil society, national sympathizers, has been really very good. They have been able to sort of capture the imagination of people in supporting their cause. And in Bailadila, because of lack of access, lack of media attention, they have kind of remained a bit ignored. Niyamgiri movement largely and for the most part has remained incorruptible because the people were from within the community and they all had a common goal and a common objective. While in Bailadila, the motivations have been questioned, they have been dilly-dallying, some of the leaders have flopped from one position to the other. So this has not been a particularly secure front for the leadership to find a stable footing in. And as I mentioned earlier, that they stopped the mine from starting in Niyamgiri, while in Bailadila, the mine was already in progress for a while before the protest started. That has a big role to play because this was nipped in the bud in Niyamgiri case, and here you have to stop something which is already going on, which is already hugely profitable and which is one of the primary profit-making entities for the government. And as I mentioned, which one was within the purview of the constitutional and legal frameworks, while the others, in Bailadila, people have consistently demanded for laws and protections to be enhanced or increased or changed or modified. And for people who have studied law, which I'm assuming some of you have, you know that changing a law is very difficult rather than demanding for the law to be implemented as it is meant to be. So this has remained, it's a small point, but it's a really important point because every time that this comes in front of the court says, yeah, to be able to change the law, we have to set up committees to see if there is indeed a need and what is going on. Now, with regard to their autonomy, Niyamgiri became a state in the first reorganization in India in 1950. So it became a part of the Odisha state, while Bailadila became a part of the Chhattisgarh state only in 2000. So until then, they were a part of a larger Madhya Pradesh state where indigenous welfare was not even on the first few points of the agenda. And in Niyamgiri, they have openly disassociated themselves with the insurgency movement, while the state authorities in Bailadila have categorized the tribal and indigenous people the same as the insurgents. And there has been quite an indefensible path here for the tribals to be able to separate themselves from that. And this is quite sad because they are not the same. The tribals and the indigenous people are the victims of the strife between the state and the insurgents, but they are also being treated like insurgents in this part. The limitations, as I mentioned, of this research have been quite, I mean, they may be a little obvious also. One, access, because these are really remote areas, and even as an Indian citizen, I had to get inner-line permits to do research over there. Then the data availability has been extremely questionable because one, the data is unavailable. 2, when it is available, it is unreliable. And 3, when it is reliable, it is so minute that you can't conduct research on that or analysis on that. Now, there have been some ongoing trust issues with regard to government intervention in these areas. So anytime that a new person comes there, they fear that it may be a government agent. So it took time for them to open up to even me. And this was a big problem in the beginning because I didn't understand how to win that trust. It was only after a few weeks that they were able to at least talk to me openly. Here the problem was also related to language because in Chhattisgarh they speak this language called Gondi, which is a tribal language, and in Niyamgiri they speak this language called Kui, which is a dying language. So only about 6,800 people, about 7,000 people speak this language. So to find translators who were not only good with both the languages, that is Hindi or English, and the language which is prevalent over there, but also are unbiased, was a big problem. In the first round of translations, we had to redo them because the translator was particularly biased and was not translating accurately. And we only found it by taking it to another person who told us that, yes, he's not doing it accurately. There's some hidden agenda there. There are extreme security concerns in these areas, especially in Chhattisgarh. I have lost count of the number of times that in the strife between the state and the Naxalites, we were put in the middle, where the insurgents were pointing a gun at us and we didn't know how to respond to them and in what way to speak to them. And the state was looking at us with suspicion that we had been colluding with the insurgents. This was a really big challenge because for the first 2 field visits, I could not get anything out of this area for this reason, because what the insurgents would allow, the state would withhold, what the state would allow, the insurgents would withhold. So we were really caught in the middle. And then it took us a while to figure out a way to go about it in such a way that somehow we are able to get some data out. And so, as I mentioned, the security forces kept placing restrictions on us because they kept suspecting that I was colluding with the insurgents. So these were some really big limitations that we found there. In conclusion, I would say that in comparable mines from different parts of the world, as we can see in the China Union Hong Kong iron ore mine, the total ferric concentration in water is 2 to 3 milligrams per liter, which is still very much higher than, and this is the worst case scenario that I'm mentioning, of course, which is still significantly higher than that of 0.3 milligrams per liter. But if you look at the NMDC one, it is up to 19 milligrams per liter. The Kirunavaara mines in Sweden have up to 1.5 milligram per liter, and the Rio Tinto mines in Australia have up to 3 milligrams per liter. 19 is unacceptable and unfathomable. And how did this happen? I cannot even understand at this point, because the amount of disregard that has been given to this part of the world has been absolutely shocking. Now, under the corporate social responsibility law in India, the companies who have a certain level of profit margin are supposed to divert some percentage of their funds to local development. It has to be about 25% of the net profits per year. Now, while as a part of the law, the NMDC has had to divert these profit percentages to the state government, but these have not been used in the areas where the mining has been taking place. For instance, even if they were able to divert the 25% of 1 year's net profits, they would have been able to install biosand filters at the source of the river to be able to control the contamination a little bit. But none of that has been done. And in fact, they tried to do the reverse osmosis home machines to some of the houses in the villages surrounding the mines, which are absolutely useless when it comes to such ferric concentration. The free and prior consent guaranteed under the Indian Constitution has been completely ignored. In Niyamgiri, the lawyers, the local communities, the civil society all came together to ensure that this was done in camera, that their free and prior consent was taken in camera. And any time that this wasn't happening, the questions were raised. But with regard to Chhattisgarh, this consent is fabricated. This consent is not there, and nobody knows about this. Even the people who live there are not aware of their rights, of their constitutional rights, and they suffer in this complete corruption. Land rights have been contested. So while Chhattisgarh state has maintained the stance that it has settled almost 100% of its forest land rights, dating back to the colonial period, only about a percentage, a tiny percentage of those land rights have been given to the indigenous people. Rest of it has been taken over by the state in order to conduct this mining activity. And the government always supports this mining activity under the garb of national interest, which it may as well be in a developing economy. But most of the mining output, for example, from the Bailadila mine goes for exports. So the argument that this is in national interest falls flat. It has caused irreparable damages to the health of the indigenous communities and the environment of this area. And the environmental degradation is irreversible. It cannot be, the flora and fauna which is lost cannot be brought back. And so this has been a rather intense way of looking at it, but this is the ground reality. Now, have I been able to address the research questions? Yes. In the first, yes, what is the impact? I have been able to assess the impact of protracted exposure, which I've spoken about in areas with questionable free and prior consent. Do the mining companies have a responsibility to protect? Through international guidelines, yes. Also through the Indian Constitution, they do have a responsibility to protect, but they haven't been very good at it. And then the different modes of resistance have impacted citizen welfare, as we have seen from the two case studies in Niyamgiri and Bailadila both. One last point here is that these three people whose pictures you see were instrumental in helping me find local support in my research. And without their support, this research wouldn't have come to fruition at all, because they were not only my local support, they were my bridge to the indigenous communities, to the forest dwellers, and helped me at every step of the way. So what is written in Hindi on top is Jal Jangal Jameen, which is the slogan that Niyamgiri people take, which means water, forest, and land that belongs to everyone. They see it as a constitutional, they don't see it as a constitutional right being encroached upon, they see it as their basic human right being encroached upon. And with such high levels of pollution, the life expectancy has gone down, the quality of life has gone down, and for generations to come, this will affect them in a very adverse way. And while the contestation has been ongoing against the corporate government nexus, international attention is required and absolutely necessary to intervene in this issue and to save these communities from a certain death. So in the end, I would say that while this is an academic research, a work of academic research, this also needs to push for some action, because that is the need of the hour at the moment. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have at this point.
Medhę, thank you very much for this fascinating lecture and for your very important research which you conducted on the problem. So I am opening now the floor for questions. Are there questions? Paweł Marcisz was first. Please.
Good evening. Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, that's great. And first of all, congratulate on your research. I was very much impressed, especially as a lawyer, with the amount of groundwork. It was astonishing. But this brings me to my question. I mean, your conclusions, your discoveries are truly horrifying. What was the impact of your research? Did you publish the results in any way, or did you make them public, like in web pages and stuff like that? And was there any reply to it? Did it trigger any change, or did it start any change?
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm still waiting for my defense for my PhD. And after that, as a part of my contract at Heidelberg University, I will have to publish my research as a book. And so it will be, and I have already tied up with publishers in India to publish it in 3 or 4 languages, including Hindi and the local languages in these areas, just to make sure that this is available and accessible to everyone. The second thing is that when I brought to the attention the preliminary findings to the state authorities, I actually went through a process of self-doubt, which was triggered by a lot of gaslighting by the government authorities, talking about how this is not really happening, and my involvement in this is only temporary and things like that. And when that didn't work, I remember my father getting calls in the middle of the night from intelligence agencies asking what your daughter is doing in this part of the forest, which is an insurgent forest. Is she an insurgent sympathizer? So those kind of intimidation tactics were employed at some point. But the point is that, first of all, just to give a little background, my father was himself a general in the Indian Army, so he didn't get intimidated. So it was perfectly fine. The second thing was that I was not, because I had overwhelming evidence in front of me. I wasn't sure that this gaslighting was going to work, and it didn't. So, and the third thing is that after my thesis, after my defense, this will be published, and I will be pushing for it to be circulated, especially in the areas where this problem is the most severe.
Pavel, your hand is raised. Do you have another? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a short follow-up question about the intimidation. It's quite scary, but did your institution, which was the University of Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken, protect you in any way, or did they try to protect you in any way from this? Because it's besides it's a criminal activity, it's also an infringement on the freedom of science of academia. I mean, did they do anything?
Well, Heidelberg University did not give me the funds to conduct the research because I was on a scholarship from India. And when I did tell my supervisor about this, so he did write to the Indian embassy in Frankfurt, or Indian High Commission in Frankfurt, discussing these issues. And then he was assured, and so was I assured, that this won't be happening again, and I can go back to India without the fear of any sort of intimidation. The thing is that was after my last field work, so I didn't really experience after that if it did make an impact or not. But other than that, there was no real intervention from the Heidelberg University.
Cezary, or would like to ask the question, Cezary?
Hello, thank you for your lecture and work, which I consider very important. My question is, what is the general approach of the authorities of the Indian government towards environmentalism as a set of ideas or ideology? Is it portrayed as a dangerous idea or anything else?
So this has a twofold answer, this question. So on the one hand, constitutionally speaking, Indian government has classified environment as a very high priority area for interest and attention. And this has been the case from 1950 when the constitution was enacted, wherein there are certain guarantees, especially for communities and areas which are protected. For example, the area where I conduct my research, or if you may be following the news at the moment, the Nicobar Islands in the south, in the Indian Ocean, in the southern overseas territories of India, or island territories of India. So these islands are all protected these indigenous lands are protected by the Indian Constitution. That is one part of the answer. The second part is that while environmentalism is seen as an important principle to follow, in reality, this is not seen as such, because as a developing economy, the biggest concern, I mean, mining contributes to about 12% of India's gross domestic produce. So when it comes to mining, this environmental clearances are really ignored unless someone talks about it and brings it to the attention. For each of these projects, there was an environmental clearance required, and the Constitution says that these environmental clearances have to be re-examined after every year. It doesn't happen at all. And at least in this case, I remember that the last environmental clearance re-examination that happened in Dantewada, or in this Bailadila mountain range, was back in 1997. So after that, it hasn't been re-examined at all. So it just has stayed where it has stayed, and that's basically the approach is that the philosophy.
Oh, Medhę, we lost you, I think. I think that there is something wrong with our speaker's connection, so we can wait for a couple of seconds. You're back.
I'm sorry, my internet here is a bit weak today. I'm sorry, I don't know, where did you lose me? I was, I think, answering the question about environmentalism. So the bottom line is that the philosophy of environmentalism is very much appreciated and seen as an important theme, but in practice, it is completely the opposite.
Thank you. Well, at least the philosophy is appreciated, which is
Yes.
not so common after all, at least now. Okay, I have another question, which comes from my ignorance, for which I'm sorry. But could you tell us a few words about those insurgencies? Do I understand you correctly that there are local rebellions in India right now, and some of them are because of the environmental problems?
Yes, so this particular insurgency, as it has been classified now, this started back in 1947 or 46, actually, even before independence, where this was originally in this state called West Bengal, which is on the eastern part of India on the border with Bangladesh. And there was a demand for the peasants, from the peasants, that they should be allowed rights to the lands that they were tilling. In the effect that some of those peasants were shot dead to curtail the rebellion, but it just made the rebellion much bigger. So from there, this particular movement, so to speak, started. And then it went all across the country in different forms to pick up local issues and start supporting or start garnering support for local issues. In Chhattisgarh in particular, the local issues that were taken up were that of indigenous rights, number one, and number two, education for people. But as time progressed, the philosophy again behind these resistance movements kind of diluted, giving way to criminalization of a lot of activities. So the last, let's say, the last threshold of ideologues who were leading this movement was again back in early 2000s, and since then it has only been more or less criminalized. And so as a result of that, a lot of it is engaged with in this mining area with smuggling. Now, while iron ore doesn't have any doesn't have any value in the open market, but just smuggling it and taking it to refineries and getting it processed can give them some benefits here. And this is prevalent in other states also, especially in states where coal mining is more prominent, because coal can easily be openly traded as well. So while this insurgency started as a people's movement, it has devolved into a completely void of ideology, criminalized smuggling kind of a insurgency, which is based only on tactics with intimidation, bombing, mining, or bombing or setting landmines and things like that. And this has been going on since 1947 officially. And in every state, it has some different issues. And the security forces, they take this opportunity to use this particular insurgency to club the indigenous communities with them, and just completely dismiss the problems that the tribals are in fact facing. Does that answer your question, at least in part?
Yes, I have to read more about this issue. Thank you.
This is called Naxalism and the Naxalite movement. If you're interested, you could read about that. Yes.
Thanks.
So more questions? Actually, I have one question. So, Medhä, certainly studying these communities, you had some comparative perspective too. So my question is whether these are just the extremes, very particular situations, or communities like that are more numerous in India.
Mm-hmm. In India, more such communities exist. In fact, this is not even the worst case scenario. So there is a particular mountain in Odisha state, which was also an iron ore rich mountain, which doesn't exist anymore. It has been completely flattened. And the communities who live there have been forced into a life of poverty, doing odd jobs in daily wage work in bigger cities all across India with the less than minimum wage, because they contribute to the unorganized sector. So this is not even the worst case scenario, but this is also quite horrific in terms of just the impact that it has had based on water contamination. My aim is that in my postdoctoral study, I would like to look at the health impact more minutely of not only this particular area, but also other areas where indigenous communities have been suffering in India. There is one particular community, indigenous community, where there is you can find, or you can mine thorium from there, and it's a radioactive substance. The entire community, or a large part of the community, was diagnosed with cancer over there. Or another one where there is arsenic in the water, and the whole community has, like, from children to older people, everyone has skeletal disfiguration. So these are not one-off cases in India, and not only in India, but in developing countries in general, because with the race for development, it is an essential part of the growth agenda to ignore these kind of things for the benefit of economic development, or in the name of economic development. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yes, I'm just. It's just the follow up for the question. So, so how big is the scale of the problem, the contamination of water by mining business in India?
So in this particular case, this river Shankini Dankini river, just in its original form, flows 274 kilometers, and then it joins the bigger river Indiravati, which then joins the third largest river network in India, Godavari. So the scale I haven't really calculated in total, but I know that for this 174 kilometers, the scale is quite high. I only looked at the samples from within the 40-kilometer radius of the mine. In future, I would like to look at the scale in a much more deeper level, yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there more questions? Okay, if there are no questions, Medhę, I warmly thank you for being with us, for giving your lecture. And I hope, and I think I can express this hope not only for myself, but also for my colleagues, that your research will be noticed by the international community. And we really hope, and I believe that your research will help to solve the problem, or at least to gain some attention for it. So it's really amazing what you do, and thank you very much, Medhę.
For hosting me, Maria, and thank you for your kind words. And I do hope that I can talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.